Hello, and I'm delighted to give this talk for Clare Library's History Week in 2024. And I'm going to talk about the reclamation history of the Shannon Estuary and its extraordinary story and how much different it is from the actual natural. Okay, my name is Kieran Hickey. I'm a lecturer in geography at University College Cork and has done past work with a number of other colleagues on the reclamation history of the Shannon Estuary. So firstly, we're going to provide a context. Then we're going to look a little bit about the Shannon Estuary itself, some historical background and data. I'm going to focus on the Fergus Reclamation in particular and the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company, because this is probably the biggest attempt at a large-scale reclamation project on the Fergus, but also it's fairly well documented, as a number of company documents has actually survived down to the present day. And we'll see how that works out. And then I'm going to follow up that with a replacement company called the Fergus Reclamation Company, mention other reclamations in passing, and also some implications and conclusions. So, why was the Shannon Estuary potentially reclaimable? And one of the reasons, of course, is there's large-scale mudflats and sandflats in European estuaries. And indeed, these developed in the post-glacial period, and these actually potentially yielded very high quality farmland in the right circumstance, particularly the ones that were mud flats as opposed to the ones that were sand flats. They're commonly constrained by training walls and embankments, and these tend to stop the natural tendency of the mud flats, sand flats and channels to migrate, which means the estuarine shape has become increasingly inflexible. So you're basically confining the estuary to a particular shape. And this problem is really exacerbated by reclamation. And we know that reclamation is a human activity that's been carried out throughout the world and in many areas and over many time periods. Well, the Romans were particularly good at reclamation. Japan has an incredible reclamation history, as has many parts of China. And of course, much closer to home, the Dutch would not have a country, or at least the country they have today, without significant reclamation activity. And there's even a hint of evidence of some Dutch involvement in the Shannon Estuary reclamation, because they would have had the technical know-how. Even within Ireland, there are other areas where reclamation was common, and there's in pockets throughout the coastline of Ireland, north and south. But the largest other area where reclamation took place has to be Wexford Harbour. And here we have the Wexford Slobs, which we know today. And we're looking at a reclamation of about 2,000 hectares between 1813 and 1870. But these are much smaller than what happens actually in the Shannon in total over a similar time period, but also going much further back in time. So what do we know about the Shannon Estuary? Well, firstly, it's macrotide, which means it has a big tide. Okay, so at Fines, for example, the tide goes from 0 ordnance datum, so 0 sea levels, up to 4.9. At Limerick Docks, it can go from minus 0.6 to 5.44. So it is quite a big tidal range of nearly 5 meters in places. It's also, of course, not just Ireland, but also Ireland and Britain's largest river system, and it drains approximately 33% of Ireland, approximately 15,700 square kilometres. And that obviously feeds fresh water into the estuary. Seawater enters the estuary from the Atlantic Ocean between Loop Head and Kerry Head, and it's a very extensive and very large estuary. As a result of the river and the gradient of the river itself, there's lots of alluvium or river deposits, and lots of the land areas which have been farmland for some time are actually based on this alluvium, which is quite fertile, but they require flood protection and actual drainage infrastructure. As a result, there's a dense network of rivers, streams, creeks, arterial drainage channels and sluices, and other features that show the scale of drainage activity and land protection. It's quite a deep estuary, but not comparison to the fjords of, say, somewhere like Norway. So water depth mouth is 37 metres. At the confluence with the Fergus Estuary, this is obviously on the main channel, it's 19, and it's down to about 5 metres approaching Limerick City. So this is an older photograph, but it shows the upper Shannon Estuary near Bunratty, showing these extensive sand and mud flat areas and these little small intertidal islands that appear at low tide as well. And these are very useful actually for reclamation, as they can indicate areas that are worth reclaiming and that are capable of being reclaimed. It all shows in the far distance here, if you can see here very clearly, the very flat areas that have been partially reclaimed here in this case. This is an oblique aerial photograph. This is from Cabot 1999, but I think the photograph's quite older. And it shows some of the reclamation activity. You see these walls. There's a breach area here at the end of the walls here. And this is part of the area we look at in detail of the Fergus Reclamation Company, but the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company before that. And we can see other areas down here as well. And just hint of areas that have been reclaimed in the past. In terms of the estuary itself, it's quite a complex structure. And the estuary that we see today is only a tiny fragment really of its geological footprint. So if we look at this diagram in detail here, we can see that this is the existing channel that we have today, this nice light blue dash thing. Beneath that we have lots of estuarine sediments in light yellow. Then we have more wetland sediments, which would be more organic and less sandy, silty, in darker greens. And then around that you have glacial deposits, which would be predominantly gravels and sands. And then you obviously got bedrock, and up here onto the right, on top here, you can see our reclaimed land with our stepped functions down here, and also upland soils here associated with the post-glacial period. So it shows it's quite a big structure from a geological setting, and what we see today is really only a tiny, I suppose, the top tip of the actual estuary itself. Okay, so in terms of the historical background, well, if we look at previous work done and looking at the archaeology of County Clare and County Limerick, we can see that there's certainly evidence for reclamation possibly back to Viking times. The land would have been easily reclaimed and would have been fertile, so it would be an easy target to reclaim. There's also some historical data as well, which I'll talk about later on in the talk, which shows that certainly reclamation activity goes back into the medieval time period. If we look at the map evidence, if we look at the first edition 6-inch to a mile ordnance survey of this area in the 1840s and 1850s, we can see extensive evidence of reclamation activity, including obviously embankments, drainage channels, pumping stations, all sorts of evidence, clear evidence of reclamation prior to 1840s. What I'm going to focus on though is the best documented scale of reclamation, of course, is the period up to 1915 as evidenced by the second edition ordnance survey. So basically a lot of the work we did was to compare what happened between the first edition ordnance survey in the 1840s and 50s at 6-inch to a mile and what was evident by 1915 in the second edition and then up to the present day. And this particularly includes the Fergus sub-estuary of the Shannon, but also, if we look at the more modern maps, some evidence of small scale reclamation post 1915. So this is just to give you an idea of where the evidence is coming from. So as well as the map evidence, and I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail now, there's evidence in the National Archives. And these are file numbers relating to reclamation activities carried along by, in this case, is County Limerick. And we can see the file numbers on the left. We can see the townlands. We can see the areas reclaimed in terms of hectares, and then in brackets in acres. And some of them are quite small, 20 acres. Some of them are quite large, 105 acres. And we can shows also the year of activity. So 1860s, 1850s, 1870s as well. So this is Carrigadirty, Rock and Newtown Town in County Limerick. And here we can see obviously some evidence here of embankments, more embankments along here, and embankments at the front. So layers of embankments going back forward, indicating reclamation activity in a stepped or phased basis going back to the medieval period, even suggesting here as early as the 16th century. And again, this would only have been carried out because it was worthwhile to do this. It would yield really good quality agricultural land, mostly for grazing. We also have some excellent evidence from Aidan O'Sullivan's fantastic edited book, Foragers, Farmers and Fishers in a Coastal Landscape. an intertidal archaeological survey of the Shannon Estuary. And Aidan is very clear about the Viking and the historical evidence that the activities date back well back in time, even up to 1,000 years ago. There's also some very interesting, from the County Limerick side, some interesting evidence from the period from the 1740s. And this is from a fantastic diary of Nicholas Peacock, who was a County Limerick farmer and agent. And he talks very much about embankments and drainage as well. So it gives an insight into what was being carried on 100 years prior to the first edition Ordnance Survey. So just to give you an idea of what was available from Nicholas Peacock, and there's no doubt in my mind there's other material like this out there that we haven't been aware of. So relevant diaries or estate records or even early maps. So he had lands in the towns of Kilcorley and Kilmarine, north of Adair and the River Meigh, and he records indications of activity related to what he described as his intake lands. Well, that's a very interesting word to use, intake lands. He also referred to them as corcas or marshes, and we know that Cork, of course, is the great marsh of Munster, but it also means that they were intertidal. So he's definitely talking about the intake of reclaimed lands from the River Meigh, or what was then the Meigh Estuary itself. So 1741, September the 15th, and I've used his original language here so you can see the spelling is quite interesting and challenging. I came home and found the men at the Carcass lands where the tide overflowed this morning. So obviously still a challenge day, and you get tidal overflows or storm surges. August 29th, 1744 talks about the violentness of the storm, and all he lost was lots of apples down, obviously late August. And he was in dread of an overflow and sent the men to the banks. So obviously he was worried that his embankments were going to fail and that his land would be overflowing. And obviously in August, in that time of year, he would be just waiting to harvest, or have just started harvest if he had either grass to cut or even if he had crops to take in. But occasionally it was bountiful, because he sent, in May 6th, 1745, he sent men out looking for sticks that went floated up with the tide. So obviously there was a tidal overflow. He was looking for any wood or sticks that he could get from the tidal overflow. Again, if we look at 1747, obviously a sequence of tidal overflowments or storm surges. January 31st, the tide overflowed a little. And then in February 1st, he says the tide overflowed all the banks in several places, and his Carcass or his intertidal marshy areas or lands were flooded. And also throughout he makes mention of the drowning of animals. So for 1749, February 1st said, I had 2 sheep drowned. And that was one of a number of references to drowning of animals, presumably associated with tidal overflows and also with storm surges as well. And this obviously we're talking about the 1740s here. And there's no doubt on the Clare side that similar activities and similar events were taking place as well. So if we're talking about the reclamation of the Shannon Estuary, we're talking about probably of the order somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 hectares. Why was reclamation so common? Well, firstly, there was obviously these corkers or salt marshes or intertidal marshes were capable of being reclaimed into top quality grazing land. So there was a financial incentive to reclaim them. There obviously was technological know-how to carry out these reclamations. And there's just a suggestion of some Dutch input here in terms of expertise. So they knew how to do this, or at least they thought they knew how to do this, as we'll see. There were changes in the economics of large estates in Ireland, particularly around the famine period in the 1840s. So there was a movement, as we know, brutal movement away in Ireland from tenant farming, and a movement towards large-scale grazing of sheep and cattle, as well as horses as well, to some extent. And this resulted, as we know, in obviously the collapse of the tenant farmer in the 1840s and 1850s. There were mass eviction in many estates throughout Ireland, and the creation of large-scale kind of range-type land where sheep and cattle could be grazed. There was a surplus of cheap labour. You know, up to the 1840s, Ireland was awash with people and awash with cheap labour. So it was easy to pay for these large-scale reclamation works, which were mostly done by hand. We're very much before lots of machinery in farming in Ireland, so mostly done by hand, much as Ordnance Crusher was done, dug out much by hand, even in the 1900s. There was an extensive export trade developed to Britain and beyond, so there was a market for the sheep and cattle meat. And also, which may surprise some people, the development of the Victorian railway network also facilitated and encouraged some small-scale reclamation in crucial areas, because it was easier for the railway network to develop along the low-lying coastal strips than it was into the mountains and into the higher land, and into areas where there was more developed estates as well, which maybe didn't want them. So if we look at the Victorian railway network for Ireland and for the Shannon Estuary, we see that a lot of the actual railway development was along the coastline, and this encouraged and required actually the reclamation of some areas. So if we look at, for example, the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company, which I'll talk about in detail just in terms of how much employment was going on. This is from the 1880s, so it shows you that, as you'll see, that they'd already were at this for 20 plus years and still were no closer to completion. The number of workers involved, peaking in October. Here we have 340 in October, or 342 in September actually, and then falling away as we get towards the winter part of the year. And we can see the number of labourers or quarrymen was quite high as well. So much of it was hard physical labour. We can also see in terms of, and I'll talk again in a bit more detail about this, is how the reclamation was carried out, because there was lots of legal implications, particularly in relation to the foreshore, as there still are today in terms of any sort of foreshore development. But also this gives us a nice insight into the role of the railways. So here, Kerry and Clare Reclamation Bill 1853, Kilrush and Kilkee Railway and Powell and Sherry Reclamation Act 1860, Kilrush, Kilkee Railway and Powell and Sherry Reclamation Amendment Act 1861, Kilrush and Kilkee Railway Act 1865, and the number of these bills in the same area tells you that these schemes were not as successful. Again, the one I'm going to talk about in detail, the Clare Slobland one, Initial Act 1873, Amendment Act 1878, Extension Act 1879. Again, if we go back to Kilrush and Kilkee Light Railway and Powell and Sherry Reclamation Bill 1883, South Clare Railway Company Bill 1884, and the Fergus Reclamation Bill 1886. So you can see the railways here are embedded in these reclamation acts or bills, and these went through the Parliament in London. So these were important bills and required strong political support to get through the legal phases as well, and like I said, involved foreshore activity. For the cartographic data, we looked at the Second Edition Ordnance Survey maps up to 1924, 6 inch to a mile or 1 to 10,560. One of the critical things that really helped was there was the 50-foot contour circumscribed the reclamation zone, so we wouldn't look outside that area by any means, and that's 15.24 metres above mean sea level, but in fact if it was 10 or even 8 metres above sea level it would have been better. We looked at land that was adjacent to the banks of the estuary, rivers and streams. We were looking for reclamation features, embankments, artificial drainage channels, sluices, regular field boundaries, regular field sizes, drainage ditches, flap sluices, drain outflows, embankments and even local place names. So all these features kind of gave us an idea that this was reclaimed land, and then it could be ground truthed by sampling subsurface sediments. So what was above what would in many of these areas actually is a relatively thin modern looking clay soil, which is not actually technically, but below that you get the intertidal marshy sediments very quickly, or even the glacial sediments as well, depending on where you are. So you can look at that by sampling or coring through the surface soil and looking at what's beneath immediately, and that gives you a clear insight of what was reclaimed or not. Mention some of the surviving documentary information prior to 1839 to 1840, but needs much further research, whether it's estate records or individual records. There's not much of it about that's evident at the moment. There may be a lot of it out there, but it's unknown to me. Where most of the evidence we get in terms of the Shannon reclamation, certainly in the 19th century, it comes from the National Archive files from the Irish Quit Rent Office. And obviously the Irish Quit Rent Office doesn't really give you any insight into what their responsibilities were. a fairly obscure part of what would have been the colonial public administration in Ireland. So the Irish Quit Rent Office had responsibility for British Crown lands, including critically the foreshores. So they had foreshore responsibility. Proposals for reclamation required the sale of the foreshores, usually by act of the Parliament. So they didn't just give you the foreshore, you had to buy the foreshore off them. And within these files then you had letters, memoranda, draft bills, legal documents, statements of account, and even occasionally little sketch maps. And they also record the process of establishing and operating the reclamation scheme. So quite a lot of detail, all handwritten, very long, detailed documents, often written in quite formal handwriting as well. So not the easiest to read. So I'm going to focus in now on one particular scheme and the scheme that followed as well. And this is a large-scale reclamation attempt in the Fergus sub-estuary in County Clare of the Shannon itself. And we know that in total about 2,370 hectares were reclaimed or approved around the Fergus estuary, which is now a contiguous area, so it's now a complete area. We also know that reclamation took place in numerous phases and schemes. And we're going to focus in on one particular scheme, and that in some cases companies were actually established for the purpose of land reclamation. We're going to look in this case at the Clare Slob Reclamation Company. And associated with this obviously was the Clare Slob Land Reclamation Act of 1873. Now, interestingly, from a landscape management perspective, when these companies got legal power, got the acts passed, they got actually incredible powers in terms of altering the landscape. Most unusual. So, for example, they could divert and turn the course of any river, stream, creek and drain them. They could cancel existing rights of way. And they could even purchase land by compulsory purchase order. So, in a sense, they got a carte blanche to carry out and alter the landscape as they saw fit. So, as I said, to give the company to significantly alter the estuarine environment. And because these rights were enshrined in these reclamation acts, they had the legal power to do so. So this is a map that myself and Professor Michael Healy of Mary Immaculate College Limerick produced of the areas that we thought were reclaimed and still do today at some point in the past, not necessarily in the last 200 years, based on the map evidence from the first edition Ordnance Survey and the changes from the second edition. So you can see various areas that were reclaimed along the Limerick-Kerry side, and particularly obviously you can see here the Meigh, also stretching up into Limerick City, and then we have areas around Ballyglass, Shannon Airport, but obviously major activity here in the Fergus sub-estuary here. So Isla McGrath, Island of Anna and Ing, these sides, very much large scale reclamation activity. And obviously extending further out into the estuary, which we haven't shown here. So just the administrative structures and legal position, just to emphasise that, all foreshores, including salt marshes, are owned by the Crown. The Quit Rent Office was the agency who dealt with that. The foreshore rights had to be purchased. This involved negotiations, but also an act of Parliament. But most small-scale schemes didn't actually go through the formal process. So much so that the Quit Rent Office was concerned about reclamation occurring around the Shannon Estuary without permission and payment, that it sent a retired army officer to identify illegal reclamation schemes and seek recompense for the Crown. Now, I haven't found any evidence of what exactly happened in any of these cases, but certainly it indicates that reclamation activity, as well as the more commercial large-scale ones, was going on a small-scale piecemeal basis as well, without recourse to the more formal Quit Rent Office structures that were in place. So probably more to be discovered there if the material survives. So the reason we focused on the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company was obviously information, large-scale information in the National Archives, in the Quintrent office files. But more importantly, I suppose, is there are 3 bound volumes from the company surviving in the Trinity College archives, which we had access to, and also a small amount of material from the Public Record Office in London. And the documentary material, primarily in the National Archives, forms correspondence to the Quintrent Office, letters, surveys, maps, legal documents, deeds and contracts of sale. However, the material in the 2 of the bound volumes of Trinity College are the form of engineering environmental data. So actually how they put it together, the work is being carried on. They obviously had a met station of some sort in operation, even though it only records wind speed and direction. So it's obviously somebody's used to the wind, and also tidal data was also being recorded as well. And then the 3rd volume was really more about the work and wages reports. So what was done and how many men were employed doing what. So those 3 volumes, I suppose, are critical in getting an insight into what was happening with the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company. But they date from the 1880s, which is very late on, considering that the company was set up in the 1870s. So the area they were interested in was just south of Clare Castle, between Island Magrat and Island of Anna, in the upper western part of the Fergus Estuary. We know that already significant reclamation had taken place in this area, because if you look at the 1842 6-inch to a mile map of this area, there's already extensive linear embankments that are identified along the coastline and even further inland, so indicating that reclamation took place prior to 1842. It's also interesting to note that even at this stage, Island Magrat is landlocked, which indicates it was reclaimed, whereas Island of Anna is still an island in the estuary, but only just. So again, the place name's even telling us that changes have taken place. In the second edition ordnance map for this particular area in 1915, this area has been radically transformed. A second line of embankments has been added, and the remains of a seawall close to the main channel of the Fergus Estuary, or Fergus River, is actually is evident as well. So the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company, which we'll talk about, was originally going to claim an area of 101,431 acres in this area. And this would landlock Island of Anna and complete reclamation out to the main channel of the Fergus. So it would radically overhaul the inner Fergus sub-estuary if this was successful. But as we'll see, that's not the case. So this is based on a map that's in the files here, with some place names added. So this is the main channel. This is Island Magrat Point here. So indicating this area was already reclaimed, and we know that's the case. A series of embankments along the existing coastline and further inland. And Island of Anna here is actually still an island, but these are the extensive Slobland areas capable of being reclaimed given the right engineering context. And this was the target here, was this huge area in here, which would have made effectively a huge area of new farmland and would have been quite valuable. So what do we know about the company? Well, we don't know as much as we'd like to think. Set up by 4 individuals, most part was John Walker, with a company address in Dublin, set up in 1870. Initial target was 1,431 acres, with an estimated worth on completion of £170,000. And that would have been a huge amount of money time. So that was why they were very interested in reclaiming, because they said the potential for this land was enormous. Over £1,000 an acre. So when we consider that land today, good land today, is going for over €10,000 an acre, it gives you an idea of the value of this land. The reclamation was to cost £60,000, so it would still leave a clear profit of £110,000, and it was to be financed by a share issue of £10 each. In addition, the Crown, Marcus Cunningham and Baron Leakenfield were entitled to £6,000 compensation between them for the loss of foreshore plus 5% of newly created land. So the total cost would have been about 70,000, maybe a little bit more than 70, if you translate the 5% of the newly created land into value itself. So over 70,000 in the end, still leaving close on 100,000 profit, and obviously a huge new estate for somebody. Given legal power by the Clare Slobland Reclamation Act of 1873, and like I mentioned, the company had enormous powers. in terms of altering the landscape, the drainage, rights of way, and compulsory purchase order power as well. Very large numbers of workers were employed in the scheme, as I showed you earlier, in excess of 300 workers at times, mostly as labourers. So it would have been an important provider of work for people in the area, and probably would have helped enormously with people trying to survive in the post-famine period. So there was work available, just as there was work available for the Ardnacrusha Crusher power station when that was built back in the early 1900s. Detailed scientific monitoring was also undertaken, including weather and tidal observations, and detailed plans of work in progress on the various embankments were also kept, and thankfully also when they failed. So it gives an idea of why, in the end, this became a disaster. These are the types of workers that were working on site. This is 1885, so we consider that the Reclamation Act was 1873. They were still at it 12 years later. So here is the week ending the 22nd of August 1885. So you can see labourers and quarrymen 219, quarrymen at Lisheen 20, nippers 12, carpenters 8, yard and watchmen 6, stonemasons 5, boatmen and pilots 4, horse and guide 4, smiths helpers 3, and then various other small numbers working like fitters, engine drivers, firemen, engine cleaners. So there was some engineering engines as such there. Overseers, office cleaners, there was a storekeeper, there was an office clerk, and there was also a timekeeper as well. So there was an office on site, and there was people carrying out what we consider to be office duties today, and then the various other tasks. But we can see that the bulk of the work was carried out by labourers and quarrymen. And that would have been hard physical labour. So, I've already hinted that this was a disaster, but we can now see just the scale of how poorly this company performed and what eventually happened to it. The initial act gave the company just 5 years to complete the scheme, or else the foreshore returned to its previous owners, i.e. the Crown. As a result of a number of breaches in the new embankments due to storms, the scheme was not completed. So they got additional time in 1878 and in 1879. But even despite these extensions, by 1882, the scheme was still not finished, and substantial sums of money were still owed by the company to the Crown and the previous foreshore owners, and owed to the company by some of the investors. So this was becoming a money pit, really. Nothing was happening, and the progress was very slow, with lots of big setbacks. This just gives you an idea of some of the setbacks. This now is 3 years later. This is the 17th of May 1886, and this again is as a result of a major storm going up the estuary with a big storm surge. You can see here we have low water extraordinary spring tide, low water ordinary spring tide. So this would be effectively what we see as low water day, and then we get high water spring tides, mean high water tides, and we can see that the seawall here has been substantially breached. So not strong enough to withstand the storm surge, and also with the breach would come the flooding of the area immediately behind that, and they would have to repair the breach and effectively start again. So you can see very clearly that these breaches were very significant, and these happened on several occasions according to the record, and based on the failure of the scheme, probably happened multiple more times before the actual recorded ones. So the scheme in a sense was kind of doomed, because they didn't really succeed in the first 5 years because of the technical problems and their failure to understand how estuaries operate properly, and the under-engineering probably of the walls and the need for these walls and embankments to be. So they had terrible problems with the company. So from 1882 to 1892, the company was in and out of the land courts trying to retain control of the scheme and its benefits. This was partly because the Commissioner of Public Works spent an additional £60,000 to complete the scheme between 1886 and 1888. So a huge amount of money was spent. In 1887, the scheme was finally completed. In 1890, the land was sufficiently dried out for Slobland to go ahead and yield the company some income. But here's the hammer blow. because the markets for cattle and sheep meat had effectively dropped dramatically at this time period. So the land, as a result, that was going to be reclaimed, also the value had dropped dramatically. And instead of getting 170,000, which they estimated, they only got 2,300. And this didn't even cover the debts to the Crown and the original four shown owners, which was 6,000. So it was a disaster. The company was a complete failure, and the scheme was never successful. And even then, although the land was dried out, it is clear from the sale map that no interior work like drainage had been carried out by the company, which meant additional money would still be spent to make the land suitable for agriculture. So it still wasn't finished to some extent. So this is the actual sale lot. So you can see that the actual is now a completed barrier here stretching right out to the River Fergus. Extensive seawall. Island of Anna is now incorporated within the reclaimed area. This is Island McGrath and Island McGrath Point over here. And we can see this is the large lot. This made the £2,300. And I can't remember what exactly lot one made for Island of Anna. So the company lost all the money that was put into the scheme. It's hard to know exactly how many shares they sold, but certainly a figure around £100,000 would not be unrealistic. But that isn't the end of the story. Because when we look at the Second Nation Ordnance Survey of this area in 1915, it shows that there were further failures and that part of the reclaimed area had returned to Slobland as the seawall had been washed away. So this seawall here effectively didn't survive very long. And it took them a long time to build it because it kept being washed away in sections. And again, by 1915, it was washed away again. And a whole area in here was reclaimed back into intertidal marshy areas. So ultimately showing just how much of a failure the scheme was. However, over 700 acres had been reclaimed, probably by the Fergus Reclamation Company, which was set up in 1886, sometime between 1892 and 1915. Effectively, this company came in and took over. Well, we don't know very much about the company, but it had a much more modest scheme to reclaim land and was successful in the inner part of the Fergus sub-estuary, but not where the wall was. So the highlights the principal cause of the failure of the main scheme, despite its eventual completion. This was that the reclamation was too close to the main channel of the Fergus estuary. This proximity would put immense pressure on the embankment during high tides, spring tides and storm surges, typical of North Atlantic depressions, and also, as we know now, with the likes of Hurricane Ophelia a few years ago, at the tail end of Atlantic hurricanes. So failure really was the inevitable ambition of this over-ambitious reclamation scheme. They could possibly have done it, but they would have need to have done it in phases, as was done with the previous reclamation. But as you get closer to the main channel of the Shannon system and also the major sub-estuaries, the closer you get to the main river channels, the more difficult it becomes to reclaim and the more environmental pressure comes from things like storm surges and high sea levels. So in the end, as we can see here, this is the Fergus reclamation scheme. Here we can see the remains of the previous seawall. We can see the area that was reclaimed. So Island of Anna is here. This new area in here, and Island of Anna lower and upper. And this was done by the Fergus Reclamation Scheme in 1886 with this new barrier system here. And we can see these very regular field boundaries, and in some cases they're identically sized, showing that this is reclaimed areas. And there's lots of features here on these, like pumping stations, etc., that show clearly, and drainage ditches that show clearly this is all reclaimed area. So this would have been successful. If the original company had done this first and then done it in a phased basis along this, they may, possibly reclaimed the whole area, but they were overly ambitious. So this is essentially the area we see reclaimed today, and the remains of the seawall is still extant in this part of the Fergus estuary. So, if this was just one part of the reclamation story of the Shannon system, we put all the 6,000 to maybe 10,000 hectares plus reclamation, what does that do to the physical environment of the estuary? Well, firstly, it means it's no longer a totally natural environment. So it modifies the way the estuarine physical environment operates. And the estuary has been changed in terms of the movement of sediments and the location of sediments and the processes within the estuary itself. The water body is unduly constrained within artificial embankments, which means that in the context today, we have a sea level rise. In normal circumstances, the channels would just migrate landward, and that would relieve some of the pressure. But this isn't the case where you have extensive embankments and walls. It eliminates that. It also reduces the dissipative and water storage capacity of the adjoining low-lying areas, which were once tidal wetlands. So it changes the flood relief qualities of these low-lying areas, which should be allowed flood and then drain out as well. Much as the Shannon callows have not been fully reclaimed in many parts of the upper Shannon system, because it's better to let them flood and drain out than use them as summer pastures. It significantly alters the character of the Shannon wetland system, and it changes the sediment circulation transfer patterns, and that of course should be tides and how they operate, with associated alterations in ecology, hydrology and relative sea level. So it affects the whole physical environment of the Shannon system. And now with rising sea levels, it presents even more challenges, because of course low-lying areas are the most vulnerable to rising sea levels, and reclaimed areas tend to be the lowest lying areas of all, and these then are the most vulnerable down the line, especially with rising sea levels. On top of that, the high wave environments in big storm systems, the storm surges, and of course the tail end of these big storms, and even the tail end of hurricanes. So how much do we think it was actually reclaimed? Well, the work by myself and Professor Michael Healy did, we came up with a minimum of 6,500 hectares based on the map evidence. But clearly from the map evidence, it was clear to speculate that the real figure was obviously much higher and could be even as high as 10,000 hectares. So based on the work of Aidan O'Sullivan and the archaeological evidence, certainly even reclamation may have been prehistoric, but most of reclamation occurred in the 19th century in government-backed schemes. Reclaimed land forms large contiguous areas, while smaller reclaimed areas are usually associated with embayments, river outlets and tidal channels. So there was large-scale reclamation work, but there was lots of piecemeal and small-scale reclamation works taking place as well. And obviously this presents management challenges going forward, in that these areas are artificially outside of the natural Shannon estuary system. And obviously the biggest challenge they're going to face is the rising sea levels and the implications for wave heights, for storm surges, and how these will become an increasing threat to these reclaimed areas as we proceed to the rest of the century. And it's not unlikely that we will see a 1 metre sea level rise in the whole of the 21st century, which will put many of these areas under significant threat down the line. And finally, just to finish up then, it shows that the nature of the Irish landscape change has been quite dramatic, and that we still have a lot to understand and tease out. And if anybody wants to read up a little bit further on this research, the general article where we estimated the large amount of reclamation for the overall Shannon estuary was published in 2002, and that gives you a good idea of that's how we came up with a figure between 6,000 and 10,000 hectares. And then a little bit more detail, and I've talked about this in detail, but there's a lot more detail on an article that myself and Professor Healy wrote, looking just in this case at the Clare Slobland Reclamation Company story. And I think both these are fairly easily available online if you want to have a look. And they're also available on my ResearchGate website as well, if you want to have a look at that. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks to Clare Library's History Week for inviting me to give this talk. And in fact, I'm hoping to publish in next year another journal article on the Meg reclamation, which is much smaller scale because of the survival of these lovely Critter Office files. Thank you.